All right, I think we're live streaming in the whole nine. Look at us go. Look at us go. So we'll give everybody a little bit more time to get logged on here, and then we'll start hopefully promptly right at 1.
Switch gears, we'll go to pruning a little bit. Pruning essentially is done to facilitate harvest and to increase light insertion. So research into pruning in Florida probably began around early 1950s, 1951. We really started in earnest using mechanical pruning in the 1960s. And the process of pruning, if you prune the sides of the tree, it's called hedging. If you prune the top of the tree, it's called tapping. And it reduces, again, the size of the tree so that you don't have these seedling trees that we originally had. You know, those trees would be 30, 35 feet tall. You don't want to climb a ladder where you have a canopy on the side of the tree and it's just hanging on the very top in a tree that's 30, 35 feet tall. So it makes harvesting not easy. As the trees are small and it's really these are some examples of some mechanical pruning that we use.
Sorry, guys, we're trying to get Elaine set up in the next room to answer your questions, and it's just in the usual way of things, nothing's working.
They can hear you. Yeah, you want to mute. But hopefully that doesn't mean him. I think it means that's where they can't hear us.
Yes, we can.
But what I was going to say about plant was like Lower Petalum. They spout new growth there where the cut is.
Yeah.
And so like the guy that does my lawn, when I asked him once, it's been a while now, but to prune my lower petals.
Yeah.
And so he did the typical straight across the top,
Yeah.
straight down the
Yeah.
sides. And so I got all this growth up here, and bottom was like,
Yeah,
just almost bare.
because it was outshading the
Mhm.
bottom.
Yeah.
But
So,
they're supposed to do it like this. So that the
well,
bottom
for lower petalum is supposed to be
is a free form.
right, like on little arches.
So that way you're supposed to clip them at different places.
Exactly.
Lois, it's Vicky.
Yes.
You're not muted.
Okay, thank you very much.
Now you should be able to do. Whew. All right, crisis averted, kind of. That was that. Am I hearing myself twice? So there's way more people registered than are on here right now. I'm kind of giving everybody a minute to get in here.
Internet went out. It went out.
Here?
No internet. It's been down for 40 minutes.
Bob, it's not that down. We can hear you.
Well, I'm using cellular. My internet here, where it's usually quite good, is strangely, it's been down for 40 minutes. So that's why I'm late.
Ah,
But let's see if I can. There we go.
okay. Well, we have 11 people, way more people than that registered.
Okay, let's give them a minute.
Come on, Ryan.
Let's see here. I've never tried this through my phone.
There we go.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
You can't hear me?
No, you're good.
Yeah, Bob, we can hear you.
Strange. Okay. Hi, Vicky. I needed you this morning. We needed some expert advice. You've got the Three Stooges working the CLC garden. We needed some expert help. I had to look up a few plants using picture this. Uh-oh. There he is. Let's see.
Hey, is that
It looks good to me.
everybody seeing that? All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So the way that this works and the way that this is going to work in the future, like I said, I'm using you guys as a sort of a test base, is that I will have myself here on Zoom speaking to the public generally. And then I will have, right at the moment, you're going to see that I'm on here twice. That's because Elaine's in the Master Gardener office and she's on my laptop and she's looking at it that way. And so she's going to be here to answer any of the questions you guys have in the chats. So she will talk if you guys ask your questions in the chat, she'll get you an answer. Okay, well, I can't help her right now. So she'll be answering your questions in the chat, and then this is going to be streamed to YouTube. It's actually streaming to YouTube right now. You should have got a little notice when you signed on that it's doing that. And then we will leave that recording out there on YouTube for people to watch subsequently as they see fit. But go ahead and ask any questions that you have in the chat. In the future, I'd like to have somebody on YouTube as well answering questions. But, you know, in the future, 3 of the 4 people that said they'd be here today couldn't. So it's fine. We'll deal with that. Don't worry about signing in here. I've already got you guys through the registration through Zoom. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So, of course, today we're here to discuss pruning. I'm Josh. I'm your residential horticulture agent. You probably know that, being as your own master gardener. So we'll go ahead and get started here. I normally start off my programs with a little spiel on what extension is and why it's important and all those things. But being as you guys are master gardeners, you already know that. So we'll just go on with this show. So the thing we're concerned about here is pruning. So why do we even need to prune? What I have on this slide is about 7 different reasons that you need to prune. The only 2 that I want you to take away from this are tree safety or tree health and safety. Those are the only real 2 reasons I want you to maintain or to keep in your mind when we're talking about pruning. We're going to speak to these other ones, but those are the 2 main reasons. Another thing I want you to take away on this slide is that when you are pruning, you only want to take about 1/3 of that tree at a time. Now that's a rule of thumb, and we're going to talk about the times that you're going to violate that rule. And that's going to be more with your fruiting trees. But in general, you only want to take about 1/3 of that tree. The reasoning behind that is there's a root to shoot ratio that you want to maintain on every plant. So you don't want to overwhelm the root system by taking too much of the plant off at one time. You can actually shock that system and you can create a lot of issues.
We're
Only seeing the title slide. It's not changing.
nope, not yet.
How about now?
Better, thank you.
Okay, I'm in the wrong one then. Great. All right. So this is everything I just said to you guys. There's a bunch of reasons on here. I'll just reiterate real quick. There's a bunch of reasons on here why you would prune. The two that you need to remember, you want to prune for safety and you want to prune for tree health. We're going to keep this 1/3 rule because of the root to shoot ratio of every plant. And we want to keep that just so we don't overwhelm one or the other. You guys seeing all my slides on the left too?
Yes.
Okay, we're just gonna roll with it. Okay, tools of the trade. You guys are of course all familiar with hand pruners and you're all familiar with loppers and you're all familiar with the various saws. What you may not realize is that there's different versions of each of these tools that exist. The one that you're gonna recognize the most and the one that you are definitely gonna recognize. I have pictures on the next slide, but this one was so busy I didn't want to throw pictures on here too. The bypass hand pruners are going to be probably your most common tool that you see when you're pruning. That's the one that's got kind of a hook and then it's got a blade that crosses over, which is why it's called a bypass pruner. That's the most common one out there in the world. It's usually for the smaller type stuff that's coming off your tree, say about 1/4 inch or less. And that's going to be the one that is most common pretty much anywhere. But there are two other versions of hand pruners that I just want you to be aware exist. The first one is this straight pruner. That's going to be really much more for like cut flowers and things of that nature. So if you're running a rose garden and you're selling those big long stem roses, you would use those type to make those flowers, to cut them off of the stems. In pruning, you're probably not going to use those. I just want you to know that they exist. The third one is the anvil pruner. That's one that you probably, as a non-professional pruner, will probably never actually use. It has a straight side and a blade that comes down onto it. It's really for dead stuff. It's for things that are really hard. You wouldn't use it on any living tissue because it would be more likely to crush the tissue than cut it. And you don't want to cut off the water flow through those stems. So that's what you really only use that anvil pruner for really dead stuff and really hard woods. And you're only going to see that really in people that professionally prune for the most part. And that's just because it's a tool they're going to use because they know how to use it a little bit better. Loppers, you have the same scenario. You have the bypass, which is again just that curved blade with the blade that crosses over it, which is why it's called a bypass. These are the ones that almost everybody has if you happen to have a pair of loppers. I have one in the back of my truck right now. And it also comes in that same anvil version. Again, you're not going to see that really unless you do this for a living and you're kind of much more the type that would do this for a living and have it for the reasons that you would need it to cut that big hard dead stuff. Third, I want you to remember there's pole pruners. There's 3 different versions of pole pruners. You're going to have one that's going to have the bypass blade, much like the loppers and the hand pruners that we've already talked about. And it's going to be on a big, long, probably 10 or 15 foot long pole. You're going to reach up there. The 3 different versions are, there's one with a string that you can pull that makes that lopping action happen. There's one with a saw on it, just a straight saw that you would then use to saw like you would normally. It's a manual saw. And then there's one that comes with a chainsaw version, which is by far the most fun, but it's also the most dangerous and the least precise. So if you're going to buy a pole pruner, you really do need to pay attention to which one you want and the reasons you want to get it. As far as saws are concerned, the type of saw that you're most likely going to see when it comes to pruning is going to be the one that folds up into the handle. You break it out and it's just a manual saw. That said, there are other types. There's the pole saw, of course, version of that we already spoke about. And then a bow saw. A bow saw is a piece of metal in the shape of a bow with a blade connecting it. And that's really there for your much bigger pieces of wood, or your much bigger branches. I do want to point out that there is a place in pruning for a chainsaw. There is a place for it. It's a very non-precise instrument. So it would really be for very large, almost trunk size branches that you would have on there. It's probably not the best idea for you to use it as an amateur, but it is a tool that's available for pruning. It's just not very precise, which is why I kind of warn you against it. If you are very adept at using your chainsaw, then by all means, go ahead and use it. So here's some pictures of those different pruners. And you can tell if you look on the left side here, just in the hand pruner section, the difference between the bypass and the anvil pruners. And like I said, that anvil pruner is, excuse me, that anvil pruner is much more of a professional style tool. It's going to be something there for the dead woods and things of that nature. And you really do want to have a good idea of what you're doing if you're going to use that one. But that's just an idea of the differences. And then of course there's a pruning saw there, and there's a set of loppers there to kind of give you an idea. Now, the important thing when you use these tools, something you really want to make sure is that they're maintained well, that it's not going to break as you put that pressure on it from that branch. You're going to want to make sure it's nice and sharp, and you're going to want to make sure that it's disinfected. Now, disinfectant is probably a step that a lot of people are going to skip. The reason that it's so important is if I'm pruning a tree over here, and let's say in the gardens out here, let's say I'm pruning this cryptomeria that we have in the tree out here, or have in the garden out here. I cut a bunch of branches off it. Unbeknownst to me, that cryptomeria had some kind of fungus or some kind of bacteria or some kind of something in it. I then take those pruners and I go to a different tree, let's say this banana shrub out here, and I start cutting branches off of it with that same tool, not having realized that that first tree had some sort of disease. I've now transferred that disease from one tree to the next. That kind of emphasizes the reason that you're keeping everything disinfected is so important. And you can use rubbing alcohol for that. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate. Some rubbing alcohol, it all evaporates very quickly and it disinfects very quickly. So it's a great tool for that. And you don't need to dilute it or anything. Just rub it on there real quick, let it dry, and then go to pruning. The biggest example of that, and I've given this example in all my other classes, so I'll give it to you guys too. The biggest example of that is up in Canada. They have a whole bunch of canola fields up there. And one of the problems with their canola fields is nematodes. And they actually can transfer nematodes from one field to the next. So believe it or not, they have to pull their tractors over this grate system and completely wash their tractors from top to bottom before they go into a new field. And they do that to prevent transfer of those nematodes. It's the same concept here with disinfecting your tools. So just to keep in mind, that kind of thing, it doesn't just apply to diseases. It can also apply to insect pests or nematodes in this case. But that's just to kind of give you a scope of why that's so important. So now we talked about what you use to cut these branches, but where are you going to cut these branches? You can see on the picture on the left here, that's called a branch collar. If you see that little bit of tissue that's kind of bunched up there right where that branch meets the trunk of that tree. What that is sort of a combination, and it's an indicator of a really strong connection on that tree. And we're going to talk about an indicator of a not strong connection on that tree when we get into the safety stuff. But that's an indicator that that branch is really well attached to that tree. And it's a combination of the sort of the xylem and the phloem that exists in every plant. And it's the xylem and phloem are the water conductive and the photosynthetic conductive tissues in that plant. So it's very important that you don't disturb that tissue as you're removing that branch. So the goal here is to get as close to that collar as you can without actually damaging the collar. Sorry, my light likes to timer itself off. I guess next month we'll do this in the Master Gardener office. What I was saying is it's important to get as close to that collar as you can get without actually damaging that collar. And we're going to look at what that damage looks like in a little bit. Not every branch, not every tree on the other hand has these collars. Sometimes they have what they call a branch ridge, which is what's here on this picture on the right. Same concept. It's a combination, and it might be a little bit hard to see. You can sort of see the line coming down there on that branch. It's a combination of that xylem and phloem tissue, and again, you don't want to disturb those tissues in the main trunk of the tree. So you need to get as close to that ridge as you can get without actually damaging the ridge. And that's again, because you don't want to damage those conductive tissues. If you guys have any questions, make sure you're asking Elaine. I hate to think she drove all the way down here from Jay to not answer any questions. So throw them in the chat and she will get to you. All right, so now we know where to cut, but how do you cut these branches off? Well, there's a three-step process every time you prune a branch off. And it's a three-step process for a reason. And I keep getting this question in the live classes I'm doing, which is why I'm going to bring it up to you. On this picture on the bottom here, I want you to imagine all the way to the left there where you see that A and B. Imagine that there's an entire branch hanging off that side of that tree. There's leaves out there, there's acorns out there, there's a lot of weight on the end of that tree. So how do we take that off without damaging the tree? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go about 4 to 6 inches up from where that collar is, and that's where we're going to make this A cut from the bottom side of the branch going up. The reason for that A cut is because if we just came down, if we just took this B cut without taking that A cut first and we came down from the top, we risk all of that weight coming off the end of that branch all at once and taking the bark down the trunk of the tree with it. So we're very concerned about that because we don't want to open wounds in our tree that don't need to be opened. So that's why we make this A cut first from the bottom up. And the reason we do that is because now when we, and I should say, when you're making that A cut, you're going to go up until your saw begins to bind up a little bit because the weight of that tree is going to start to push and it's going to pinch your saw a little bit. So you're going to go up until you start to feel a little bit of that and then go ahead and pull your saw back out. And then you want to go up about 3 to 4 inches toward the end of the branch from that. And from the top of the branch, begin to cut down. Now, at that point, you're still going to get that big drop of weight off the end of that branch. And it's probably going to tear the bark from where you're making that cut. But that's fine because you've made this cut along the bottom here, and it's only going to tear the bark to that point, which is kind of what you're seeing here in the second half of that picture. So that's okay. That's not a big deal because you're going to remove that whole thing and that whole stump anyway. Now that all that branch material is gone and now that all that stuff is out of your way, you can then go back and make your cut to take that little stump off the edge of the tree. And now very precisely, very deliberately, you can get as close to that collar material as you want and go ahead and just take that little bit of stump off without having to worry about it tearing up the entire half of the tree. The reason we don't want a lot of open wounds on our trees, we worry about fungal infections moving in and we worry about bacterial infections and things like that. That's the reason that we would approach this with a 3-step process. So now your tree branch is gone. How do you know that you did it properly and how do you let that heal over? Well, the first thing that we're not going to do is we are not going to put any kind of paint, any kind of, I think they used to sell like a putty that they claimed was great for these types of wounds. They used to sell all that kind of stuff. You'll notice that they don't hardly sell that stuff anymore. And the reason they don't sell that stuff anymore is because they've discovered that, and with the antithesis of what it's intended to do, instead of excluding the moisture from that wound, it actually winds up trapping the moisture against that wound. They find that stuff fails more often than not, and you get moisture trapped right up against that wound, and then it decays the tree, it causes all kinds of infections, and it causes all kinds of issues. So we no longer recommend that you use any kind of paints or any kind of creams or any kind of anything on those trees. Go ahead. These trees have been losing limbs for millennia. They know how to heal the same way that if you cut your arm knows how to heal. Just let it do its thing. What we're seeing in these pictures down here, the picture on the left is the cryptomeria we have right outside my window here, pretty much right outside my window. It's a nice, completely circular cut so that we know we cut that one in exactly the right spot. What you want when you see these is that perfectly circular cut. That tells us that we were as far as we needed to be from the, I believe this one had a ridge, from the branch ridge on there to make the cut perfectly. That cut healed over, that cut's looking great. On the other hand, on the one here on the right, what we're seeing is we got a little bit too close to the tree on this one, which is why you're seeing a much more oval shaped wound. Now it did heal over, and that's true, and that's what you want, but you may notice that there's a little water sprout coming out of the top of that wound. What happened is we got too close and the tree's trying to make up for that. We interrupted that tissue to the point where now it's trying to strive for life. So there's a little bit of water sprout coming out of that one. And then you can see a little bit of green sort of infection. So it healed, but it didn't heal the best. And so that one, we just got a little bit too close to the tree, which happens. It's not the end of the world. As you can see, it healed, it's fine, but it got a little bit too close to the tree. So we're just trying to avoid that. What we really want is what's going on in this picture on the left. Nice, perfect round circle, exactly where we needed to cut, and everything healed over and it's looking good. Now, why do we prune? And I went ahead and I put the branches impeding walkways as the first bullet here. It's probably not the most important safety reason, but if you think about it, it's probably the most prevalent. So I was in Pensacola last weekend, and I don't know if you've ever walked down there, sort of next to that Seville Quarter and all that kind of stuff. They have a whole bunch of trees growing over the sidewalks there. All of those trees I had to duck under because they'd never prune them and they'd never take care of them. So I had to duck under all of them. So one of the things that you can do when we're talking about the reasons to prune for safety is you can do what we call raising that tree. which essentially means that you pick where you want the canopy of that tree to be, and everything below that, you can go ahead and take off. Now, keep in mind, that's going to count pretty big towards your 1/3 rule. So this may be something that you're going to do over the course of a couple of years. But you can do that to get, if you have a walkway at your house, or if you have over your driveway where people are walking, you can raise those trees up so that people aren't going to whack their heads on them. And I just wanted to go ahead and get that one out of there because that's probably the most prevalent one. Now, as far as safety is concerned, anything that's damaged, diseased, or decaying can come off of those trees pretty much any time of year. You don't have to worry about the right time of year to prune to remove that stuff. It's dead, it's taking resources from the tree. There's no reason to keep it. Go ahead and prune it whenever you need to. A good example of both of those is if you look at the picture here on the left, that's a whole bunch of tree branch that's sticking up out of the top of that canopy, and it's all dead. There's nothing growing on it. There's no reason to keep it. Go ahead and get rid of it. It'll make that tree look better, and it'll make that tree healthier, which is exactly what you're looking for. The picture on the right here is an indicator of decay in your trees. And if you see these big mushrooms coming out of your trees, like what's happening here, that indicates that there's something wrong with the tissue. That woody tissue, for whatever reason, is dead, because mushrooms always eat dead tissue. They're called saprophytes. Saprophytes eat dead tissue. When you see mushrooms, that means decay. So that's just a good indicator of two things that you would need to prune in these two scenarios. Now, the last thing that we need to worry about for safety, and I guess you could also put this one under tree health. Any branches of that tree that you have that are crossing over one another, you want to go ahead and get out of the way of one another. The reason you want to do that is because as the wind blows, those two pieces of bark will rub against one another. Anything that's going to rub like that is going to create an open wound for a tree. We've already said we don't want open wounds on our trees because it invites fungi and it invites disease. So we want to get rid of as many of those crossing branches as we can. Again, keep in mind that 1/3 rule. This may be something you want to do first so that you don't shock the root system. And again, that 1/3 rule, you can exceed it a little bit, but you don't want to do that too often. But you want to get rid of those crossing over branches. You're going to most commonly see that in like crepe myrtles. And we're going to talk about crepe myrtles here in a little bit. Now, as far as tree health is concerned, we're going to want to look into the structure of that tree. If you look at the picture down here on the left where it says good structure, poor structure, and you realize that most landscape trees want a single dominant leader. Now, there are trees out there that are multi-stemmed. Again, crepe myrtles is a great example of a tree that's multi-stemmed. And the philosophy behind that is going to be a little bit different than the philosophy behind a single leader tree like what we have down here on the left. That single leader, you want to keep that, and you want to keep one because it is going to produce a plant hormone we call auxin. Auxin tells that tree or that branch or that shrub or whatever it is to grow as tall as it can to find as much light as it can. That's what we want in our trees. That's a desirable trait in our trees. On top of that, we're going to want even branches up the entire way, again, to sort of avoid that crossover branch and that rubbing on one another that we had. Now, if you look directly to the right of that first picture, under the one that says poor structure, what you might notice is that we have 3 dominant leaders in that tree, and that's not what we want. So what we have now is that tree putting all of its energy into trying to grow 3 separate leaders. We don't want that. We want one leader. We want it to all the other things to follow on that one leader. 3 leaders, it's producing too many hormones, and it's actually detrimental to the tree. So what you would want to do, and they should have done this when this tree was just planted, is taking those other ones off. But at this point, you would probably take those down about halfway. 2 of the 3, you'd probably keep that one in the middle and the 2 on the sides. Take those down about halfway, and then the next year, go back and go ahead and take the rest of it off. Again, you're trying to avoid taking too much of the tree all at one time. Anything that you're going to have, any branches you have that are about 50% of the trunk, you may want to take those off as well. And that's just because that's a lot of weight that you're now putting up into the arbor of that tree. And as you get wind and as that tree shakes, there's a big chance of those falling off or damaging the tree because they're just so heavy. So that might be why you want to do that. This is also the time when you're looking at the shape of the tree and the structure of the tree where you'd want to balance your canopy out. If you have a lot of foliage on one side and no foliage on the other, it might behoove you to trim some of this back to keep that even. And again, for wind, if something's really heavy on one side and it keeps getting wind, it's going to keep pulling down. Well, the more weight and the more stress you put on that trunk, the worse it is for the tree. So you're going to want to keep your canopy nice and balanced out that way. Something that's very important, if you look at the picture here on the right, where it says Gilman E, it's his picture. That's a V crook in that tree. Most trees, when they have a branching system like this, or a branch is coming off there like that, what you want to look for is a good U shape in that crook. What we have here is a V, so what we have here is most likely included bark. Included bark is actually damage in the joint of that tree. And again, as the wind blows, you could very well lose half of that connection. That's not such a big deal unless that tree is planted close enough to your house that the section you're going to lose is going to go through your house or onto your car or onto any of those other types of things. Now, if you have something like this in one of your trees, you really do want to call a certified arborist. I am not a certified arborist, but you really want to call a certified arborist because there are things that you can do to help this that aren't pruning. Now, there's a good chance that the arborist is going to tell you to go ahead and prune one side of it off, but if this tree happens to be precious to you, there are ways that you can get around having to prune that. It involves some bracing and some lashing things together. And they're viable options, but at some point that's probably going to need to come off, and the arborist is probably still going to tell you that, but there are other things you can do. And I just want you to be aware that you can do other stuff. But that is definitely something you need to look for. All right, now that we've gone through all of that, we're going to talk about fruiting trees, and we're going to throw all that knowledge out the window. I hate doing that to folks, but fruiting trees is just such a different philosophy than pruning anything else. In this case, we're going to want to take that dominant leader away, as opposed to the landscape trees before where we were keeping that single dominant leader. In this one, we definitely want to take it away because it's going to encourage that tree to bush out a little bit better. Basically, what happens is you take away that apical dominance, you take away that apical meristem. It produces a different plant hormone called cytokinin. Cytokinin encourages bushing. So you're going to want that to be a little bit bushier. You're also going to want to make sure that you're paying attention to whatever IFAS documents exist to tell you what type of wood you want to keep versus what type of wood you need to get rid of. For instance, apple trees fruit on, I think it's 3 to 4 year old wood. So you would want to keep any of the wood that's on that tree that's kept in this little structure like you have on the pictures down here at the bottom. You'd want to keep any of the 3 to 4 year old wood because that's what's going to give you your apples. Any of the new wood, probably not. Any of the older wood is going to become less productive, so that might be time to trim that off as well. So it's a delicate balance when we speak to pruning of fruit trees, and you really want to make sure that you're looking at the documentation and you're looking at what we're telling you from IFAS, from the IFAS perspective, to keep those trees productive and happy and healthy. Another reason that you would take that single dominant away is this last bullet right here. You want to keep those trees at about 8 feet or less. The reason for that is you could actually reach the fruit without having to bring any extra equipment to do that. I believe that's it for that. So now let's talk about what we don't want to do. What we don't want to do here on the left, and they did this for hurricane purposes, but here on this picture on the left, they've used heading cuts to completely eliminate all of the foliage on that tree. That's not good because, as you know, you need foliage for photosynthase. If you don't have photosynthase, things tend to die. What they've done here, they did this for hurricanes because somebody in their wisdom said, hey, if there's a bunch of wind blowing through here and these don't have any branches on them, that tree is not going to get hurt. Well, you've pretty much killed that tree in the process of trying to not let it get hurt by hurricanes. So topping and heading, and this is actually called hat racking when we discuss pruning, is a process that you want to avoid that. It's just not good. It's not good for the tree. It's not going to help it in hurricane. It's just going to hurt it in the long run. So just avoid that practice. Here in the center picture, what's happened is they've over pruned their tree. You could fly a jet through the center of that tree and it's just way too open. It's not attractive. It's not good. In the process of over pruning, they probably violated their 1/3 rule pretty readily and pretty easily. And so it's bad. Make sure that the cuts you're making are for a purpose. You don't want to over prune. That said, this picture that's down here on the right, what they've done is they've used heading cuts to make that a perfectly round canopy. Again, you're going to start to run into the risk of over pruning. You're going to run into the risk of taking that more than that 1/3. You're going to run into the risk of shocking that root system and that shoot system. And it's not good for that. You don't want that tree to do that. And on top of that, it's going to encourage bushing at a much higher level. So you're going to have to come back then in subsequent years and you're going to have to prune even more because now you've told it, I don't want these little shoots sticking out, but you cut it. So you defeated the apical meristem. So now instead of one shoot sticking out, you've got two or more. So rounding is also not a good practice and it's frowned upon. Consult the IFAS documentation, find out what type of, or what the shape is for those trees and just put it in a place that shape is going to be conducive to growth there. So now, when do you prune? This is really going to be dependent on what type of tree you have, how prone they are to decay, how quickly they grow, things of that nature. But in North Florida, in general, and again, this is in general, so keep an eye on your tree. But in general, you're going to prune about every 3 years. A couple of things you want to avoid when you are pruning. You want to make sure that your trees are dormant. If they're deciduous, make sure they're dormant. And you don't want them coming into or exiting dormancy at the time of pruning. And the reason for that is there's just a lot of metabolic stuff going on in that tree. And as it's going into dormancy, where it's just going to be sort of a sedentary state, you don't want to mess with the photosynthetes flying around in those tissues at that time. And then again, as it's beginning to come out of dormancy, you don't want to mess with what the tree's got going on, because now it's starting to wake up and it's starting to move all that fluid around, and it's just not a good time to mess with it. So make sure your trees are completely dormant when you do it. For some things, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more on a few slides when we talk about azaleas and hydrangeas, but you want to follow the May rule for anything that flowers. The May rule states that if something flowers prior to May, it's flowering on last year's wood. If it flowers after May, it's flowering on this year's wood. So as you're thinking about when you need to prune and what you need to prune, make sure that you're paying attention to that, because you don't want to cut off all of your buds and have it not flower at all that year. So pay attention to that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when it comes to azaleas and hydrangeas here in a minute. Excuse me. So a few special cases and some things I wanted to mention, because these are the types of pruning scenarios that you may get into and people don't quite get it right. Shrubs and hedges are a little bit of a weird animal. And this is another one where you do want to use heading cuts, because you want to make sure that there's nothing, you don't want any of that little wispy growth growing up over the top of where you want your canopy to stop in these scenarios. So what you're going to do is, where you see those little wisps sticking up, go down about 6 to 12 inches, prune it down there. And you want to make sure you prune it at the top of a bud. Don't leave a 3-inch piece of sticking out, because it's not going to do anything. So prune right at the top of a bud. It's going to make that shrub or that hedge want to get a little bit bushier and a little bit fuller, which is why you would do that. And then it's going to sort of fill out from the middle, rather than you just taking stuff off the top and then you got to go back and do it again the next year. The reason you do that, again, you want to remove that apical dominance for those little bits that are sticking up, and you want them to get into multiple sprouts so that they get what we call bushier. Make sure that when you're pruning shrubs and hedges particularly, not so much more than shrubs, you want to keep the bottom a little bit wider than the top. The reason you want to do that is because it'll have more access to the sun that way, and it should have access to more water that way. And you're looking to get resources to the entire shrub. You don't want it all at the top. If you were to cut those sides straight, you wouldn't get near as much light at the bottom as you get at the top. And that's going to cause a lot of dieback, and it's going to make your bushes look a little bit leggy and things of that nature. That said, if you do have a shrub or a bush that is leggy, go ahead and cut it to the ground within a couple of inches of the ground. Don't worry about it. It will come back. It wants to grow. It wants to be alive. In this case, you're actually shocking that root system in a good way, and you're making it grow. You're making it want to grow to get back to where it needed to be, because there's a lot of resource there and there's nothing for it to go to. So it's going to put on a lot of growth to try to make up for that. I understand that can be a little bit of a scary premise when I tell you to cut something all the way to the ground, but it will come back. Don't worry about it. If you don't like the leggy look, go ahead and take it to the ground. Some more special cases. I told you guys we'd talk more about crepe myrtles. Crepe myrtles are a multi-stem tree. So as opposed to where you wanted the single dominance in most of your landscaping trees, in this one, you're going to want 2 or 3 or maybe 4 even leaders, kind of what we have down here in the picture on the right, which I get that that's been crepe myrtled, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But you're going to want 3 or 4 dominant leaders like that, and you want that very beautiful vase shape that crepe myrtles are known for. Make sure that you're pruning them in late winter, which should be right about now-ish. It's been kind of a weird year, so we haven't really had a normal pruning season this year because everything went really warm and then really cold. But as long as they're not breaking buds at this exact moment, you should be fine to go ahead and prune, but this is the time of year to do it. Again, make sure you're keeping that natural vase shape. Suckers on crepe myrtles are one of the first things that need to go. The best thing that you can do for the suckers on your crepe myrtles, dig down into the soil a little bit. Cut those suckers as low as you can, hopefully below the soil line. Wrap the bottom of that crepe myrtle in black plastic and then mulch back over it. What you're going to find is that you'll still get a few suckers coming up, but you'll get a lot less than you would have if you've not done that. What you're looking for in that case is light exclusion, because the crepe myrtle is looking for light and it's throwing up a whole bunch of suckers out of the ground to try to expand itself when it doesn't really need to. But that's the best way to deal with suckers. Of course, anything that is dead, diseased, or decaying. Branches. Okay, I think I misspelled branches. Anything that's dead, diseased, or decaying can go ahead and come off. And crepe myrtles are going to be a big one when it comes to any branches that are crossing over themselves. Again, you want to get rid of that kind of stuff because you don't want the bark rubbing together and you don't want any sort of openings for disease to get in there. This is going to be a big one. Do not top these trees. I know it's a very common practice, but it's detrimental to the tree. It shortens the life of the tree. It gives it that little witch's broom appearance. You've probably heard this called crepe murder before. It's called crepe murder for a reason. It shortens the life of the trees and it opens up your branches to a lot of damage. So just avoid doing it. What you want to do is go up the lengths of those 4 or 3 leaders that you have, and all that little pencil size stuff is pretty much what you want to come off. You want to take that stuff off. This practice became popular because people see landscapers doing it. They assume that landscapers know what they're doing. So they go, oh, they must know something we don't. And they go ahead and do it to their trees on their own property. The problem with that is those landscapers have 200 to 300 trees a week to do. So it's very much easier for them to just go ahead and cut it at one level and move on to the next tree versus going through and cutting all the little bits off that need to be cut off. So people see it, but again, they see landscapers do it and then they go, oh, that must be the thing to do. And that's kind of how that practice has taken hold, but it is detrimental to the tree, so don't do it. So what happens if you inherited a tree or this is a practice you've been following? Let's say it, but it's been happening and nothing you can do. You didn't do it, but you need to fix it. Well, there are ways to fix it. You can either go ahead and cut all of the little branches off of that little, I call it a fist, that little fist that's at the end of your stem. Go ahead and cut off all the branches on it. Let them grow a little bit. Pick the 2 or 3, probably 2, of the strongest of those. Keep all the other ones removed and just let those 2 take over and grow in subsequent years. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to go ahead and cut this to the ground. Again, it's a crepe myrtle. It's going to grow very fast. And in a few years, you'll be back to a normal tree. When you do take it to the ground, what you're looking for is, again, you want the 2 or 3 strongest leaders that are going to come out of that. Go ahead and trim the rest off and just keep them trimmed off until they quit coming back. And you'll get back to the normal vase shape that you want with crepe myrtle. Roses. I throw roses in here. They don't really fall into the tree category, but I throw roses in here because it's something when you talk about pruning that you're going to be asked about. You always want to prune your roses in either January or February. Every rose, knockout or not, is going to get 1 good pruning a year. And by that, we mean we're going to go in, we're going to take all the dead stuff, we're going to take all the disease stuff, we're going to shape it, we're going to put it the way we want it, and all those kinds of things. For your non-knockout roses, that's going to entail leaving just a few canes on there and cutting probably to about half of a third of those canes off. And then 2 or 3 of the really strongest canes is what you want. For the knockout roses, go ahead and trim all the stuff out of there that needs to be trimmed out of there and get it shaped the way that you want it. Bear in mind, you're going to want to keep a lot of that growth that's on there. It's not like the other roses where you took it down to 2 or 3 canes. Go ahead and keep it in that bush shape and just recognize that you're going to have to go back probably later in the year with some hedge trimmers and go ahead and shape it again. Knockout roses grow continually, they flower continually, and there's not really a dormant season for them, so there's not much you can do, but you want to keep that leaf tissue on there. So again, shape it once and then shape it again if it's a knockout rose. If it's not, go ahead and prune it like you would any other rose, take it down to a few canes, half to a third of what was there needs to go away. Palms. What I can tell you about palms is the best piece of advice when it comes to pruning palms is just don't. There's no real reason to, with a few exceptions. What you can see here on the picture, we'll just go ahead and go left to right on the pictures down here. The first picture, that's called a crown shaft. You're really not going to see that in North Florida so much. That's much more indicative of a tropical palm tree. But if you do happen to see a tree with a crown shaft, those don't need to be pruned ever. That crown shaft is taking care of that. Don't ever prune those for any reason at all. The second picture here, they've done what they call a hurricane prune on these palms. The theory again being that it's not going to catch as much wind, and so it's not going to sway as much, and it's not going to damage the tree as much in a hurricane. These plants have developed in coastal regions for the past 2 millennia. They can handle hurricanes without us messing with them. They don't need us getting involved to deal with the hurricanes. They know how to do it. What you've done here is you basically just made the newer leaves vulnerable while removing all of the other leaves from the top of it. If those leaves happen to get blown off or damaged, now there's no way for that tree to photosynthesize, and you potentially have killed that tree. So hurricane pruning your palms is a bad idea. The next picture is one of the times when pruning is actually appropriate. All of that tissue is clearly dead. It's clearly not doing anything for that tree anymore. You can go ahead and remove it. Now, this also applies to your flower stalks and other things of that nature. Your palm trees do not need the flower or the fruit stalk to survive. As a matter of fact, if you remove that, if it's something you're interested in keeping, if it's a jelly palm, say, and you want it to make jelly, go ahead and leave it. It's not going to hurt the tree that way either. But if you don't want the fruit coming off of that tree and you remove that stalk, it's not going to hurt the tree. As a matter of fact, it might make the canopy a little bit fuller, because instead of putting energy into reproductive growth, it's just going to put energy into vegetative growth. So that's very appropriate pruning on a palm tree there. This picture on the far right, a lot of palm trees will get yellow, they'll get a little bit brown, they'll look dead, they'll look nasty, they'll get that frizzle tip. What's happening there is actually a nutrient deficiency. The reason you wouldn't want to cut those particular fronds off is because the nutrients that are deficient for the rest of the tree are mobile. And when we say mobile nutrients, what we mean is that they can move from one frond to the next frond, to the new growth frond. So what those fronds are essentially doing is feeding the new growth. So don't cut those off, because they're going to be there to feed your new growth. So leave those be. Anything, and I think it's on here somewhere. So any of the leaves that are kinked, I didn't have a picture of it, but any of the leaves that are kinked, provided they're not the only leaves that are on that tree, you can go ahead and remove those too. And of course, when I say kinked, I mean, the little ridge of the palm tree like that. Sometimes they get broken in a downward fashion, and all that material gets kinked. That frond's not doing much for you anymore at that point. So assuming that they're not that there are other fronds on that tree that are not kinked, go ahead and remove the kinked fronds. They're not doing much for you anymore. Hydrangeas and azaleas. These are very heavy on the May rule. Azaleas specifically. So azaleas are blooming right now. We're in February, and they're blooming right now. you are not going to want to prune your azaleas until that flower cycle is complete. When we talked about the May rule and we said if it flowered before May, it's flowering on last year's wood, that's what's happening right now. All that wood that had developed from last summer through the winter into this spring is flowering now. And so you're going to want to wait till that flower cycle is over. As soon as it's over, the buds will be spent. There will be nothing really on there until about the 4th of July when they start to grow again. That's the time to prune your azaleas, between the end of bloom but before the 4th of July. After the 4th of July, they're beginning to set buds for the next year. So you wouldn't want to prune at that point because then you're going to cut those buds off and you won't get flowers in that coming year. So that's where that May rule becomes really important. For hydrangeas, for the most part, they grow on the old wood. So it's going to be similar to azaleas. After they're finished with their bloom cycle, then you'd want to go ahead and prune them immediately afterwards, within a month or two after them flowering, because after that, they're going to begin to grow and they're going to begin to set buds for that next year's growth. The only one that's an outlier there are these panicle hydrangeas, and those are going to be they're called limelights quite often. There's some other names for them, but limelight's the one that's most prevalent. Those actually flower on new wood. So again, you're going to want to prune those in late winter to get rid of that stuff. And then as it grows through the year, it's going to set buds and you'll get flowers that way. And then these pictures along the bottom here, just to kind of give you examples. The one on the left here is an azalea. It's in full bloom, not the time you'd want to prune it. The next one over here is the lace cap version of the macrophyllum. That's going to be one of your old woods, so you're going to want to prune that one after it dies back. Again, with the picture next to it, it's an oak leaf, same thing. The picture on the far right here is a limelight panicle hydrangea. That's the outlier one that we said you'd want to prune in winter because it's going to flower on the new wood. This is another one, and these aren't going to get real leggy because it's just not in their nature to get real leggy. But this is another one that you want to sorry, Jim put something in the chat that distracted me. Oh yeah, so you can cut these to the ground. That's where I was going with that. They're not going to get real leggy, but if they just happen to get too oversized, if they happen to get some unruly growth on them, go ahead and cut them to the ground and they will come back. You may miss a year of flowering, but they will come back and they'll get back in their cycle and they'll grow back. So don't worry about it. All right, and that is all that I have. Ooh, there we go. That's all I have. This picture that's on this little slide, I liked it. I passed this on my way to work every day. This is on 89. You may notice that they have pruned it around the power lines. And so it makes me laugh every time I see it because my entire way home, all I see is this and then trees that only have foliage on one side because they pruned it around the power line. And it made me laugh. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, please go ahead and do so. Oh, let me get back to the chat here because Jim asked me something. Nobody has any questions?
Josh, this is Chris. Do you
Yeah.
hear me?
Yep.
My neighbor wants to renovate her azaleas that are giant and leggy, and they're a little bit shaded out by trees. What should she do about this? Cut it down to the bottom and let them grow back again, or the third rule?
Nope. So when you're rejuvenating azaleas like that, you're going to want to let them go ahead and finish the bloom cycle that they're currently in, unless you don't care about the flowers this year. Go ahead and get a chainsaw, knock those down to the ground, and they will come back in subsequent years and they will bloom again and you'll get flowers again.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Josh? We'd like to know when to remove material that has been affected by severe cold weather. Around Christmas time.
Okay. If you guys didn't hear that, Elaine came in and she said somebody was wondering when you would remove the cold damaged materials that we have going on right now. You're going to want to wait until we're pretty much through the risk of any more freezes. So you're going to wait till probably April-ish and mid-April at that. The average last frost date is going to be March 1st for our area, but it's not uncommon for us to get freezes through April. And so if you wait till about mid-April before you remove any of that, it's going to be better. The reason for that being, if you removed it now, it's going to inspire that tree, or it's going to cause that tree to kick out new growth. And if we wind up getting another freeze subsequent to that, it's going to freeze all that new growth off, and then you get a much higher risk of that tree not coming back at all. All of that dead tissue is a protector for any new growth. So you go ahead and wait until probably mid-April before you prune any of that off. Jim, I think you had something. You started to talk, or was that you that had that question?
Josh, that was my question.
Okay.
So thank you. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, and then we've got from Suzanne, can Vitex be treated the same way for suckers at the base of the tree as you described with crepe myrtle? They should be able to be, yes, assuming you can actually get it cut off below the soil level would be perfect. Again, the idea is light exclusion. You want to, if it's not seeing the light, it's probably not going to grow suckers. Crepe myrtles are just, you know, they're notorious for suckers. Vitex is too, but it's, yeah, if you can get it down there and get it covered up, you should hopefully be able to avoid some of the stuff. Anybody else have questions? This is a lot less people on here than registered for this. Okay, well, if nobody else has questions, I'm finished.
I wanted to ask about oak leaf hydrangeas. Do you consider them to be pinnacle?
No, so your panicle hydrangeas are going to be more of the, like I said, limelight is one of the cultivars. I think some of the other cultivar, but it's not. So your panicle, the flower growth is going to be much more that columnar type growth as far as the flower heads go. And your oak leaves are going to be much more the lace head almost style flowers like you would get in some of the macrophyllums. So the panicle is actually, it's a different flowering type on the panicle that you look for. That answer your question, Lynn?
Well, I don't ever think they look like lace heads.
Well, the picture I found of them did. Let me go back in my thing here.
They have a, I mean, they have a long hanging down flower.
Right, but panicle is going to stick up, not hang down.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, if nobody else has any questions, I'll go ahead and end this.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope it was informative. I got to figure out why not nearly as many people as registered are actually on here.
I had to register twice to get on it.
Did you? Okay.
I registered a while back, and then this when I tried to do it today, it wouldn't let me on again, and I had to re-register.
Okay. We'll work on that. It's a new thing that we're trying to do. So I was anticipating there being little hinge points in it.
People may
Okay.
just have forgotten.
I couldn't hear you, Suzanne. What'd you say?
People may have just forgotten to, to sign on at this time. Maybe if you give them a sort of like Eventbrite that gives them a reminder.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yep, and I know some other people had trouble signing on. Francis had trouble signing on, and I wasn't able to help her because we were getting into this.